Portanto, vamos dar início à segunda parte da manhã. I would like to thank Professor Philip Gummett for this talk. We'll have again a talk that will, with space for questions, that will last for an hour. So we'll have like 40 minutes plus 20 minutes of questions, or 45 plus 15. Just a brief introduction of Professor Philip Gummett. So Professor Philip Gummett was Executive Director of the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales. He devised a new structure for universities in Wales. He was also a Professor of Government and Technology Policy at the University of Manchester. And so the floor is yours. We'll hear your presentation now. Okay.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, I can't see anybody, so this is a little bit. I think there are people there, but it's not easy to know. But it is a great pleasure. I feel very honoured to be invited to come to speak to you today, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the rest of the discussion. I've also just discovered, speaking to our chair, that we share a common association with the University of Manchester, and we've just been exchanging knowledge of people that we're both familiar with. So I should explain to you why I'm speaking to you about Ireland, because I've never worked in the Irish higher education system, so I feel maybe I'm a little bit of a fraud. So I should just say, my background is, you have it here, I used to be at Manchester University, and then I went to the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales. You may know that in the UK there is a devolved system of government, so Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have somewhat separate systems of government from England, and higher education is one of the areas that's devolved. So Wales has its own arrangements for funding higher education, and I had a very interesting time leading that organisation through a period of major change in the structure of the universities, and these issues that we were hearing about a little bit earlier about problems of very small universities, and the issue of resilience and flexibility. On one occasion, I found myself talking to the Vice-Chancellor of one university, who said to me with great delight, "We have got 10 more international students this year than we had expected. And this makes all the difference to our finances." And I thought that was just terrifying, because what he was saying in effect was, about 100,000 euros. This was if you like, the value in money terms of those 10 students. About 100,000 euros makes all the difference between us being in a difficult financial position and being in a viable financial position. And I just thought, gosh, you have one bad storm and a roof blows off a building and it's gone. And so, we had to think really hard about the structure of a system that had a number of institutions that were as small as that and as vulnerable as that, and think, how can we do this better? So, and then since I left there, I've found myself, by a series of accidents, doing quite a lot of work in Ireland, and this is really the point now. I found myself involved in activities to do with the way they fund higher education in Ireland, but also I have been involved in reviews of the proposals for 3 of what are now 5 technological universities. So I've seen quite a lot of the process of establishing technological universities, and I also found myself invited to chair for the Government Department of Education a review of technological universities as well, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So that's really why I've been I guess I've been asked to speak about Ireland. And I might say too, apropos of what we were hearing earlier, I'm also on the governing body of a UK university. It's in Wales, which was a polytechnic and has become a university. And I spent all yesterday afternoon in a video conference into a board meeting for that organisation. And so, what we were talking about before, hearing about before, about the process of transition, from Polytechnics University in the UK is something which I've been witnessing and been part of in a small way as well. So we can maybe talk about that too if anybody wants. Okay, so here's what the Irish position in higher education looked like before technological universities. And what you can see in can I make this work? What you can see in red, and the red dots, are the universities, the names of some of which I'm sure will be familiar to you. You'll have heard of Trinity College, you'll have heard of University College in Dublin, perhaps of Cork, maybe Limerick, Galway. These are quite long-established universities, some very distinguished universities, and you'll know their names. Possibly, whoops, sorry, what have I done? Here we go. Possibly not so familiar would be these 14 institutes of technology. They're the blue circles, and you can see they are quite widely scattered, particularly in the sort of edges of the country, as well as a big concentration in Dublin as well. And you have interesting questions like this one here, sitting very close to Derry in Northern Ireland, where if it wasn't for the border, one would say, well, if you're looking for ways of establishing connections between higher education institutions, there's a very obvious connection to make. But there is now an international border there, and we know all about that in terms of Brexit as well, I'm sure you're aware of. So the point about these institutes of technology, they're quite widely scattered, some quite small. Professor Amaral gave some figures earlier showing how small some of them are, or were, and very much rooted in their regions, very much rooted in localities, but quite limited to in what they were able to achieve. And so the debate has been about what to do about those and how to improve the provision of higher education across the whole of Ireland, how to serve the people and the employers of Ireland in a better way. There's been... that way, is it? Where am I? Here we go, yeah. There's been a discussion about policy in respect of higher education going on for over 10 years now. There were a number of reviews, I won't go into detail, but a number of reviews from the beginning of the 2010s, looking at the economic and educational strategy, higher education strategy, all of it outlining a very ambitious future for Ireland. Ireland, and this will be familiar to you, I think, in Portugal also, suffered very badly in 2008. Extremely badly. I mean, university salaries were being cut in Ireland by approaching 20% at one stage. And I'm sure that's not unfamiliar to you in other contexts. But it was very bad, and there's been a sort of a huge effort since then to sort of rebuild the economy and rebuild society in Ireland. So higher education was seen as having an important part in all of that. And then in 2011, the National Strategy for Higher Education began to specify what shape that might take. And it talked about moving from a binary system in which the universities and the institutes of technology delivered higher education, but in different ways and in strongly demarcated ways. Moving from that to a new system of universities and technological universities. And I have put the words or the phrase, but still binary in there. That's my wording. That's not what the government said. The government talked about establishing a new system of technological universities, and as we'll see, that meant universities with full university status. But the reality, this plays back to the previous talk, is more complex than that, and what has actually been happening is not so... It's not easily characterized. So I put but still binary, and I'll need to unpack that a little bit more and explain a bit more about what's going on a little bit later. And then this got taken forward through legislation, various acts, and so on, coming through in 2018, laying out a formal framework, and then the first of the technological universities in Dublin bringing together 3 of the former institutes of technology into a new Technological University of Dublin, which is probably the largest higher education provider in Ireland. Now, I mean, bigger than any of the older universities. But that one is remarkably big and much bigger than others are going to be. And then a slow, well, maybe not so slow, but a process in the few years after that, leading to a sudden rush in 2021-22 with 4 more. So now there are 5 technological universities covering all the regions, and that leaves just 2 of the old institutes of technology not having joined that general transition. Not sure. Oh, there we go. So what was the idea? So the idea was to move from the existing institutes of technology, whose focus was mainly levels 6 to 8, with a big emphasis also on apprenticeships, working with local employers, very strong emphasis on part-time, big numbers of part-time students alongside full-time, rather different from the traditional universities, with tuition provided not just on the campus, but a lot of it in the workplace as well. A very diverse student base. I mean, particularly, we were hearing before again about different populations in polytechnics and universities in the UK. Well, similarly in Ireland, the institutes of technology, I wouldn't say they were like polytechnics. They were not as elevated, if you like, in status as polytechnics, but they were certainly dealing with somewhat different clientele from the traditional universities. Also with very strong employer links. And I do say employer, I don't say industry, because I mean it more generally. I mean not just industry, though that's important, but also public service organisations, the health service, the education service, the transport service, and so on. So, I mean, all employers in the public as well as the private sector were their sort of constituency. Very strong regional roots, and I keep coming back to this regional dimension, this issue of how do you cover the whole of Ireland with the best possible provision in higher education. Mostly modest in scale, as also said, and mostly with very limited research. Some, but very limited. I mean, one of them had some extremely, extremely strong research in one area, but most of them relatively limited. So the idea was to move from that to a system of new technological universities, and one of the first obvious changes would be greater scale and scope. So really what that meant was merging institutes of technology, bringing them together in some formation that was left to them to propose. There wasn't a government plan that said, here's what the new pattern will be. It was handed over to the institutes of technology to say, come forward with your proposals. But greater scale and scope, greater scale in the sense that they would be able to offer more than the individual institutes were able to do. And, greater scope, I suppose, is what I mean there. Greater scope in terms of what they could provide, and greater scale in terms of their overall resources and their capacity to be resilient and so on. And, indeed, as Gen said earlier, interesting debate about what scale, is... What range of scales is appropriate to things we might call universities, but clearly some can be too small, and, well, there's no question in Ireland of any being too big. There are none, beyond the sort of 30,000 range, 30,000 student range, so I don't think we have that sort of problem there. And the focus was going to be on preparing graduates for, well, the language they used was complex professional roles in a changing technological world. You will recognise, this is language coming out of government documents. You'll recognise very familiar sort of phraseology that you'd see in many, many countries. They were also going to be required or expected to advance knowledge through research and scholarship. And the phrase is again about its dissemination, actively disseminated to meet the needs of society and enterprise. And again, particular regard to the needs of their region. So that... Sorry, excuse me, I'm still not quite sure where this button needs to be pointed. Oh, there we go. Needs to be pointed. I think I've gone too far. Wait a minute. There we go. Right. So that had a number of implications. First of all was that these new technological universities were going to have full university status. They would have the title. That was clearly perceived as very important to the institutes of technology. They all wanted that. What was perhaps less clear was whether they all appreciated quite what they might need to do to be granted it, let alone the kind of wider question that we were debating or raising earlier, which is, what is a university? But clearly, whatever it was a good thing, and it was something that people wanted to have. That was going to be important to the institutions, but it was also very important to the regions. One of the things we did in reviewing the cases that I was involved with was meet local employers of all sorts. And they were almost greater enthusiasts than the institutes of technology themselves. And the employers were saying it will do so much for our region if we have a university in our region. It will make us much more attractive to American companies thinking of investing here, or whatever it might be. It will make it much easier to recruit people internationally to come and work here, and so on. So the title, very important. And then, I've already mentioned the greater geographical coverage, and at the full range of higher education levels, all the way through. That's a key expectation. Driving regional development, but not limited to the region. So already you're beginning to see a certain sort of fuzziness, and you may think that's a good thing, or you may think that's a troubling thing, but a certain fuzziness to the expectation. What exactly is being asked here? Driving regional needs, driving regional development, but reaching out to the whole nation, and actually also reaching out internationally as well. So you might have a question in your mind, so what's the difference between this and the other established universities? And that question still sits there. Full scope, all levels now from 6 to 10, all the way through, from kind of sub-degree all the way through to doctorate. And this provision was going to be oriented to the needs both of employers and learners. But very important was a requirement, a stipulation, that in moving towards this new status, these new universities were not to abandon their earlier commitment to the lower levels of higher education, the levels 6 and 7, the sub-degree level. They were not to abandon, they would keep that going. The traditional universities were not doing very much of that sort of thing. These new institutions were to keep that going. So you can see also quite demanding range of expectations upon them. And in order to do this, they were going to need sharply increased research capacity for both their staff and also in terms of postgraduate. Their numbers of postgraduates were usually quite small, and their numbers of research postgraduates very small indeed. So this was going to need to change. So they were going to get the power to award doctorates, and they were going to need to make changes in order to do that. And to go ahead with all of this, they would have to meet some criteria for designation. These were laid down in legislation. And the aim of these criteria, I suppose you might say, was to kind of deal with the temptation of people to rush forward and say, we like the idea, we like the sound of being converted into universities, please can we have that? And say, well, no, you have to pass these tests. And I have to say to you, in at least one of the cases where I was involved in reviewing them and meeting the people involved and hearing their arguments about how they were going to achieve what was needed, there was, kind of more than a little sense of, at the moment, all you've done is see the attraction of the title. You haven't really thought enough yet about what it means to achieve it, and they had to go and think again before they were able to start moving forward. So there were criteria published. That's a slightly busy slide. I'm going to go in a little bit more detail through 3 of the areas in it in a moment. By the way, I say abridged there because don't take any of this wording as literally from any official documents. I've just shortened it, condensed it, simplified it, just to try and get it small enough to present in a context like this. So, and some of this is now repeating things I've already said. So, program provision covering the whole range of the national framework of qualifications, strong vocational professional orientation, strong focus on science and technology. This word technological university itself is problematic in one sense because they're not only about technology, or at least not in the sense of technology as meaning kind of engineering. Big emphasis on work placements, continuing this engagement with the workplace. A lot of the study to be done in the workplace. Focus on the social and economic needs of the region. They would have to have the resources and the experience and the mass to ensure the pedagogical reach and quality that was wanted, and also the research quality that was wanted. And this one here about critical mass for effective and efficient governance. I just dwell on the word governance for a moment, because this was an interesting question for them, because these were, think about it in a way, quite small, usually quite small regional colleges, very much in their localities. Some of them, as I pointed out on the map earlier, right out in the edges of the country, where the focus in terms of a governing body, who do you want on your governing body, was very much driven by local interests. And a certain sort of almost, it's going too far to say an inward lookingness, but it was certainly not a focus that was stretching nationally or internationally in terms of the ambitions for what this institution might achieve. So the question of governance was an interesting one. Also the question of scale, because if these were going to be significantly larger, what were the sort of people you would need on a governing body for an institution that was very much larger than had been the case before. So this was not straightforward. And then a research policy, an active research policy, and this is the sort of language used, applied and problem-oriented, relevance to the region again. But nothing in here that says, of course you can't do basic research. And so, again, immediately questions about, well, what precisely is going to be the focus? And then, well, I've said this already a number of times now, the regional links, the strong regional links. So that was what was laid out as a set of criteria. And I'm going to just say a little bit more about three of them, which will be the ones about students, the ones about staff, and the ones about research, because perhaps these are the key ones. So if you were going to bring a proposal forward from 2 or 3 institutes of technology in order to try to become a technological university, you had to show a number of things. In terms of the students, you had to show that you were going to be able to provide programs at all levels from 6 to 10. You had to be able to show that at the time you applied, enrollments in research programs at levels 9, 10, so we're talking masters and doctorates, were not less than 4% of all your student enrollments. At least 4% of your student enrollments had to be at essentially master and doctoral level. And you had to show a plausible trajectory to get that up to 7% by 10 years from the date of inauguration or designation. What does a plausible trajectory mean? You had to show what your trajectory already was in terms of growth. You had to show what you were doing, and you had to persuade people like me sitting in a sort of international panel reading these proposals that, given all that you'd said and all that you'd showed us about how you were going about this, that was credible. I mean, you can never know, the future, but you can make a judgment that says, I'm not persuaded by that, or alternatively, yes, that sounds reasonable. I think you've got a pretty good chance you can do that, and so we will say yes. And then an expectation that the level 10 provision, the doctoral, would only be in a small number of fields and departments. So it wasn't expected this would be across the board. The notion would be you concentrate this in areas where you've got existing strength or can expect reasonably to develop that strength. But you've got to be able to show you can develop it to national PhD standard in order to then be free to award your own doctorates. And then, well, I think we won't worry about this very much, but this was about continuing the link, particularly to in terms of the lower levels of higher education provision in the locality. These, remember again, we're looking about places in remote rural areas, which are the main source of training and education for people for a whole variety of roles within the local economy. And many of those would be not people coming just straight from school, but people coming back in later life in all the sorts of ways that we're familiar with. So this is challenging, and we used to have a Prime Minister in the UK. He talked about having your cake and eating it. And there's a little bit of that, I suspect, in some of the legislative expectations here in Ireland. They're really asking an awful lot of these institutions. Then we've got the staff. What about the staff? So these institutions, the Institutes of Technology, had a history that went back some way, and essentially they emerged out of local authorities across Ireland. They were sort of local authority run. They were run very much on a model like schools, but a little bit more advanced than schools. I mean, that's kind of how they started, provide local technical needs in particular in various localities across the country. The main union for the staff, the teaching staff, is the same union as for teachers in schools. And it's a very powerful union, and its expectations have been very much focused on preserving the contractual rights of its members throughout this transition. And so if you think about taking people whose contract of employment is very much like that of a teacher in a school, with, for example, expectations about summer holidays, because there's no concept of research that might go on during the summer, for example. And you think about translating those people into a university context with expectations of strong research performance, you can immediately see there's an issue there, and indeed there has been and is an issue there. So what they were being expected to do then was to think about how they were going to, and tell us in these panels, but how they were going to construct contractual and appointment procedures that would give weight to the professional practice and the institutional engagement activities of staff, and in other words, relating to the region around them. How they were going to get this balance between teaching, research, engagement, administration. These were big challenges. At the time of application, they were going to have 90% of their staff holding at least level 9 master's level qualification. And they had to have at least 45% of them holding a level 10 doctorate or an equivalence in professional experience. So, in other words, allowing the possibility that someone could be, essentially an expert in their field, but did not have a doctorate. They had acquired the equivalence status, if you like, of someone with a doctorate because of what they had been doing, and they could demonstrate that, and there would be international peers who would say, yes, we recognize this person. There's glass technology in the southeast, for example. Very sophisticated glass technology. There are people there with PhDs. There are also people there who've worked in the glass technology field for many, many years, and they go to the international conferences and people respect them as major figures in the field. So you would say, well, they don't happen to have a PhD, but everybody treats them just like somebody who's got a PhD. So this concept of professional equivalence, concept of professional equivalence there. But on the other hand, also said, but not too many. So we will be comfortable with people who have an equivalence, but not too many of them, not more than 10% of the full-time academic staff. And then again, this trajectory point. So that's the starting point. When you apply, you've got to have got to here. And typically, when they all began this process, they might have been at around about 30% of staff at this level. So they would have to be building up in the years preceding getting this designation. And then a trajectory showing that you can get to something that looks like the other Irish universities, but at least 65% of your staff with level 10 or an equivalent designation. So a clear increase expected in the proportion of staff at that level. And then also some requirements to say, well, and then if you're going to be offering doctoral level programs, you've got to have 80% of your staff have got to be at doctoral level, and only staff with doctoral level qualifications will be able to deliver and supervise at level 9 masters, and only those at level 10 can supervise research at level 10 at doctoral level. So it was a demanding criterion, and it's something that they had to build to gradually and then show again plausibly how they were going to continue that growth process. And then research. So we get this language again of focusing on applied and problem-oriented, and we have references to social, technological development and so on. We have references, things you'd expect, international benchmarks, rather sort of less clear language, demonstrate approaches to the formation of level 10, appropriate to its research mission. Not entirely sure what that means, but certainly allowing the prospect this will be through practice-led and industrial and professional doctorates, as well as the more traditional university-based approach to PhDs. And then, what I said earlier, there would be an expectation that they would have research strength concentrated in only relatively few fields, and that might gradually grow over time. Though this was spelled out in the legislation in this way, that they would have that competence in at least 3 fields. This was according to a UNESCO definition of research of fields, and a trajectory showing they could add 2 more within a reasonable length of time. So that was the legislation, and here's where we got to by May of this year. 5 technological universities. So the first one in Dublin, bringing together 3. The second one was down here, it's called Munster, bringing together 2 of the institutes of technology. And then the other 3 coming together fairly quickly in the last year. One here in the southeast, one here in the middle. It's called Shannon because there's a river called the Shannon that you may well have heard of, well known in songs as well as geography, running through the middle. And then this one, the Atlantic Technological University. There is, if you're familiar with Ireland, there is a very popular tourist route that runs all the way down the Atlantic coast. It's wonderful to go along it. It's called the Wild Atlantic Way, the Wild Atlantic Way. And there was for a moment the thought that they might call this the Wild Atlantic University, but in the end, they thought better of that. But you can see at once, that's roughly 100 kilometers. You can see at once. That's an interesting challenge, and there are some quite big mountains in the middle here. So that's where they got to, with two of the old institutes left over. That's where we got to now. But between the formation of the first one in 2019, again, I'm struggling to, there we go. Between the formation of the first one in 2019 and the later ones, there was a bit of a sense that the momentum had dropped. There'd been a flurry of excitement about all this. One was formed and was up and running. And there was a bit of a sense, particularly in government and in the higher education, so the government, the Department of Education, the Higher Education Authority, and also among the body that represented the institutes of technology, which was called the Technological Higher Education Association. Bit of a sense among all of them that this process is flagging a bit, the momentum's died. People came forward with proposals. Some of those have been referred back saying, well, no, not you're not there yet. You need to really think harder about how you're going to do this. And others were sort of in being but not moving forward very much. So there's a sense of, what's going on here, and a sense that people aren't really clear, what this is all about. Staff inside the institutions are saying, why are we doing all this? Is it worth it? I mean, what's the point? And so on. So they decided in amongst these 3 organizations, basically the ministry, the funding body, the Higher Education Authority, and the body that represented these institutions, that they needed something to sort of reboot, if you like, that's my language, not theirs, but reboot this process. And they set up a group which comprised the presidents of the existing, by this stage, technological university and the institutes of technology that were thinking of applying or had already begun to apply for status. And by some process or other, I ended up chairing what turned out to be a very fascinating exercise. And what we were trying to do essentially was trying to kind of restate what's this all about, and can we pull a vision out so that you, the people concerned in taking this concept forward, can talk to your staff in a more positive way about it, and also promote, again, back into government and make sure all the parliamentarians and so on remain enthusiastic, given that this hasn't gone as swiftly and smoothly forward as people may have thought it was going to. And also to say, essentially to the Irish government, but also to the other stakeholders, if you are serious about this, what are the top priorities? If you want a fast and effective start, what have you got to think about in order to give this a chance of succeeding? So that was what we asked to do. We produced a report with a complicated title. If you're familiar with the expression that that a camel is a horse designed by a committee, then you may see some analogy to the title we ended up with. Everybody had a favourite word that had to be in it, and there we are. I decided there were other things to fight about than the title. So it's there, and if you're interested, there's a web link to it. What did it say? Well, it said there are some priorities for government, for funders, and for the technological universities, either existing or in being. And those four headlines, I suppose, sum it all up. There were some issues about the regulatory and the policy environment. There was a binary funding model in place let me just make sure I got this right. There's a binary funding model in place which funded separately the universities and the institutes of technology. And this was kind of historically, this had developed historically. So there were different processes through which their funding was allocated to them. And all sorts I won't try to bore you with things, many of which I don't understand anyway, which are to do with things like how pensions got paid. Sometimes, in the universities, they had to pay the pensions out of their grant. In the case of the institutes, the government paid, just as they paid the pensions of teachers in schools. All sorts of things like this that were complicating matters. But there was a binary funding model. It funded universities on one set of principles and it funded the institutes on the others. And as new technological universities came into being, where did they sit in that structure? And the answer was nowhere. They were looking as though they were going to continue to be funded like institutes of technology, but blocked together in some way. So we would say, well, no, come on. The Higher Education Authority knew that was no good, but it needed someone to start saying much more loudly and clearly, that's got to change. There were issues then also about career frameworks, especially on this issue of research. If you're going to have serious research activities in a university, you'd expect to find at least some people called professor. And the institutes of technology were not allowed to have a category of staff called professor. And until something changed, neither would the technological universities be allowed to have something called professor. So there were things like this about the career structures and career expectations. And then a third thing, which was a real problem, was if you're going to really try and upgrade what's offered, how are you going to finance it? Where's the capital going to come from for new building, for modern laboratories, for things like that? Universities in Ireland are free to borrow from the open market, and at the time, when interest rates were very low, that was an attractive thing to do. But the institutes of technology were not. They could not borrow. They could only get government funding for new capital development. So, of course, they were saying, well, how are we supposed to develop in the way you wish us to do if we can't invest in the same way that universities are free to do? So that was one set of issues. Another set was to do with collaborative networks. We were hearing about this earlier. Very important. How are they going to operate in let's use the language of earlier, of what's a new ecosystem within Irish higher education? How is that going to work, and what are the links going to be, and the relationships going to be between new technological universities and other, established universities? How are we going to do that? And there are also ways in which they needed to be working together to think about governance and building leadership, and how do you manage all this change and also presenting the concept, telling the wider world, first in Ireland and then more broadly, what's going on here in terms of developments. And then after that, some fairly obvious things about needing investment in research and needing investment in digital technology, not least because of the distances, the geographical distances involved in some cases. And all this we were doing before COVID. So you can imagine at that time lots of people saying, you can't manage a university over these sorts of distances. And then COVID came, and then we all learned to do Zoom in our sleep. And people suddenly began to say, well, it's not perfect, and it's not the only solution, but it's a lot more manageable than we had thought it might be. So the attitudes have changed a little bit, but still. So just quickly now, picking up one or two more of these areas. Research capacity, so great expectations, but a disadvantaged starting point. If you're going to be seeking research funding in a competitive environment and you start from a low base, you will lose the competition. Every time you'll lose the competition. There'll be people who could put better cases together. And so this is a real problem. And you can see there a figure about research funding in the institutes of technology was only 14% of all Irish higher education. And in these researchers, this means specialist research staff. This doesn't mean the general academics. Right? But again, very much smaller proportions than in the established universities. So they didn't have the significant staffing levels in research, and they certainly didn't have significant funding. So we said, okay, the government has got to do something about this. If you want to build up researcher numbers, if you want to build up infrastructure. Meanwhile, the technological universities need to get on with building, plausible research strategies, and we have to crack this career framework problem. And then on digital infrastructure, we said this too, clearly important because of this geographical issue. There would be an expectation, if you can envisage the map I showed you a minute ago, showing the three technological universities, that black line that went from the middle on the west coast up and then right up to the border with Northern Ireland. We're talking about, 250 kilometres, something like that, across all of that. These are complex multi-campus organisations, sometimes operating at considerable distances, and yet, because it would be one university, expected to offer their students, I've used the word uniformly there, perhaps it's not the best word, perhaps I should say equivalent. The students would expect an equivalent experience. It shouldn't matter which campus you're on. The deal for you as a student ought to be broadly the same. That doesn't mean the same courses would be available, but the overall experience you have ought to be broadly equivalent. So how's that going to work across these distances? And so we said, look, it's obvious in the modern world that all higher education institutions need advanced digital technologies. But to the Irish government, essentially, we said, but your top priority needs to be the technological universities because they will fail. Or put it the other way around, they cannot succeed if they don't have this. Whereas the other universities, well, if they have to take a little bit longer to get further investment, well, okay, but this must be the front of your list. So then we had, to my enormous surprise, being used to the way in which government decision-making emerges in the UK, within about 3 months of us presenting our report, the minister said, okay, I'm setting up a new fund, 90 million, that may sound not a huge amount, but in the context we're speaking of, it's actually quite significant. A new fund to help kickstart this process. And since then, a number of things got underway. A project working with OECD to try and draw upon international experience on career structures and contracts. A new act relating to the powers of the Higher Education Authority in relation to, amongst other things, these universities. But importantly, it has not done one thing that was hoped for, which is establish this right for the technological universities to borrow for buildings and so on. Work goes on the funding model. SFI, Science Foundation Ireland, and the Irish Research Council have actually launched some funding schemes specifically for technological universities. I mean, these are the bodies that fund research competitively in Ireland. You put research projects, proposals in. But they said, okay, we recognise this problem, that these institutes will fail if they go into the general competition. We're not stopping them going into the general competition, but we are setting up for a short time some specific funds for them alone in order to give them a boost. And then the digital infrastructure, well, there's been, some things have happened within wider frameworks. So finally, a few observations. System change needs system-wide strategy. I don't by that mean a plan. I don't mean a detailed plan that says this is how everything's going to be and who's going to do what and where it's going to be done. But what I do mean is a sense by the government of what kind of system of higher education it wants, and that needs to be clear and consistent, and it needs to endure for a reasonable length of time. That's partly to keep the momentum up. One of the experiences in Ireland was that kind of the momentum died and enthusiasm dropped, and the government and the Higher Education Authority had to sort of make it plain, we do expect this to happen, we do want to see these institutes move forward, and they actually had in one or two cases to put in some extra help to try and drive the process, put some people into the processes that were trying to organise how to bring institutions together, who had experience of this sort of thing and could help them to move it all forward. Also important to avoid contradictory developments and counter pressures. There is, for example, in Ireland, a system of further education colleges, which sits, if you like, sort of overlapping with the top end of the secondary school system and the lower end of the higher education system. And there's been a move recently to encourage further education institutions to move into level 7 programs, because it's about 1/10 the cost of doing it in higher education institutions. But the technological universities say, excuse us, you've told us we must keep level 6, 7, 8 going, as well as develop 9 and 10. And now you're bringing in more competition on level 7. This is not helpful. So this is the kind of thing I mean about, this is, very immediate. This is very soon after this process going. The sort of thing where I mean by saying avoid contradictory. We talked about investment. We talked about regulatory and policy impediments. These problems are still not solved. They're taking some time to solve. And if you think about it, the first of these universities, Technological University Dublin, set up in 2019. It's now 3 years through a 10-year process, at the end of which it's got to show very significant improvement in things like research performance. And so from their point of view, 3 years down the line, nearly 4 years down the line now, and still not able, at least officially, to create professorships. And so they're saying, look, how are we supposed to achieve what we're expected to do? And the other thing I would say, based on the experience that I've observed, is this. So much of this kind of process turns on the people. You can have all the processes and legislation and criteria and all of that you like, but in the end, you could see when you met the people coming forward with a proposal, you could see the difference between those who came in from several different institutions saying, we want to form a new institution, and you felt you were already talking to a high-powered senior management team and leader of the governing body who knew what they were about, who worked as a team, although they were all coming from different institutions, who had a clear idea of how they wanted to go ahead. And you could see the opposite, when you'd ask a question and there would be this sort of looking down the line, well, who's going to answer that, and so on. That's at a trivial level, but you get the point. It really does depend upon very good, very committed, very skillful people, and a lot of work explaining what's going on so that people understand. They're not losing their local college. They're gaining something which will be better. But there's a task to do to explain to local stakeholders that that's what's going on here. And so that's partly what I mean by these sorts of things down here as well. So all of that is offered by way of final thoughts. How this is going to work out, how successful it's going to be, Well, I think the jury is still out. It's still very early days on all of this, but that's my attempt to give a bit of a sense of how these things have developed in the Irish case. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We'll have time for questions. Portanto, questões da audiência, que eu também deixei de ver agora. Professor Ronald Barnett, please.
Philip, that's tremendous. I've learned a great deal from that talk about Irish higher education, and I was fascinated by the issue you raised about professorial titles, which I'll perhaps discuss over lunch. It's rather extraordinary. They can't just go ahead and do that. The title of professor is a protected title, it seems, in Ireland. But I wanted to just raise an issue coming out of your talk and get on to our agenda today, an issue that we haven't really addressed, and that's of internationalisation and internationalism. And I was intrigued by the range of criteria that you put in front of us that are being used in Ireland to establish these new university institutions. And it seems that the extent to which these institutions are international in orientation, in character, in the flow of students, but also the flow of staff, to what extent are they trying to attract staff from other countries? I think all these issues are really quite important these days, and I'm just intrigued to know and hear from you as to your thoughts about it and the extent to which this really is an issue which is playing out in the development of this policy framework.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, two things. Just quickly on the professor point. The problem about appointing professors and creating chairs is a derivative. Gosh, the light's even worse. I'm just trying to stand here. Is a derivative of a previous problem, which is going back to 2008 and the financial crash and very tight government control over public spending. And in the parts of the higher education sector that the government kind of directly controls, and that included the institutes of technology. They controlled the budgets in quite a tight way. They've put in place a framework for controlling spending. And essentially you can't break out of that without getting ministerial permission. And to create professors, it's not only the title, it would be the salary as well. And so, they're hitting that barrier. So people are trying to work on that, but they're having same thing applies to the borrowing. The borrowing is caught in exactly the same way. So that's by the by. International, they're very ambitious. All these institutes of technology, even in their smaller lives, if you like, had various kinds of international links. And they would have exchange programs and so on. And you talk to all of them, they'd say, yes, we've got relationships with this or that college in America and so on and so on. But the aim is very much to expand that and to expand the opportunities for the students. I know in the case of the Technological University of Dublin, I was in Dublin about 3 weeks ago, and I went to talk to the president of it to try and sort of get up to date, for the purpose of today, to try to get up to date with, what's happening. And he's very excited about the way they're succeeding in attracting international scholars to come and work there, and also international staff to come and work there, except when they hit the professor problem. And so he says, and that's where we're then getting stuck. The people would come, but then they realise there's this problem. And then, so he said, I've got one really good person. We've won an international competition, a European competition to bring in, but she won't come because we can't confer the title professor on her. And so we're just kind of holding it, hoping, but they're very ambitious. They're aiming to do that. And they are, very much of the view that, yes, we're supposed to address our region, but we address our region even better if we've got the international connections. There's no contradiction between this. We can be locally focused but we can draw upon the world, and we will have some things, we hope, which we can play out into the world as well. And so that they're very much thinking in those terms. Yeah.
Temos mais uma questão ali. Obrigado.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. It was very, very clear. On the research, my question is whether you told us that the research funding agencies were setting special programs for the time being, but whether in the long term there are plans already spelled out to finance a different type of research, applied or whatever you call it, or whether the idea is to bundle everything together, universities and technological universities, because if that is done, I expect that the research results will also be of the same type.
Yeah. As far as I'm aware, these are time limited. I don't know the precise details, but these are time limited. They're not meant to last for many years. Recognizing the problem that we identified in the report I referred to, that you really have to give a push to enable these institutions to compete seriously. So they will be applying for funding in the areas where they are already strong. I mean, I ran it when I was in Wales, running the Funding Council for Universities in Wales. We tried to do this. We tried to build up research in some of the less research-intensive universities. And in a way, we just wasted our money. We found that you could get a temporary boost and then it would just fall away again. Building the mass to be sustainable. We all know the problem. You've got a research group that's got a very few people in it, one really bright star who can pull in people from around the world and pull in money. But it's that person. And when they leave, everything collapses, and so you've got to get to the point where you've got, enough people of high caliber for it to be sustainable. So the idea is to try and help build the momentum, build the capacity, but that this will all eventually just go back into the general. They will all go back into the general public. But then you've got this issue: what kind of research? So there's all this. Technological universities. I don't know the origin of the decision to use that title. But you can see why within the sort of framework. Ronald was describing, some of this earlier. The framework of the times we live in, why that would be a title that would work well in certain political contexts and policy contexts. But the intention is actually much broader than that. It is to address, if you like, more. Professional would be a better word. Because it's not just technology, it's all across the health professions, the education, it's all of this as well. And then, we could go on for hours, I'm sure, about what's the difference between applied research and other kinds of research, and know that this is a very difficult area. So I'm not too worried about. I think they will, because of where they start from, they will start with work that is quite closely allied to the local environment and the sort of industries and employer needs that they have already been working with. And if they're good at it already, then that's successful. They can build on that, and it will kind of spread out. But I know that some of them are doing some really quite what we would call fundamental research, and it's actually not a problem. Some of this is just rhetorical from the point of view of public presentation, I think. I know that's not a very complete answer, but I hope it gives some answer.
Obrigado. Eu acho que nós temos tempo para mais uma questão, se houver essa questão. I may just finish with a quick clarification, which is, you mentioned about the criteria and demanding criteria, but I was thinking if there is specific criteria for diversity in terms of doctoral education degrees. So, for example, if you have specific criteria in terms of industrial doctorates versus other doctorates, and how that distinction could play out also between the different types of institutions.
There's no requirement for a certain, if by that you mean, are they required to have a certain proportion of the doctorates they award in different categories? Yeah. No, there's no differentiation of that sort. But there is an expectation that while they will do what we might think of as traditional doctoral programs, the sort we're used to within an old established university. They will also very actively do a range of other doctorates based on practice, based on experience, based on the workplace, partnerships with an employer, where arrangement between a university and an employer, where there's the student is an employee of the organisation, working in the organisation, coming into the university, working with a super, that sort of thing. So they're saying we want a lot of that. So we want a lot of that, but it's not specified in any rigid way.
Okay. Muito obrigado. Nós vamos fazer uma pausa para almoço. Regressamos, penso eu, às 2. Regressamos às 2 e até lá. Até já.